What I see in actual practice, and I've actually studied thousands of eviction decisions, the statistics are that landlords win their immediate eviction in about 90% of cases. So it's almost all the time. And we've seen cases like a tenant was $5 in arrears at the time of the hearing, immediate eviction.
Sarah, welcome to the Speakeasy.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here today. Episode 2. You hold a master's in law.
Correct.
You are a law professor at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law, researcher in housing and evictions, currently in collaboration with Classic Law. Interested to learn more about that a little down the road. Is there anything that you'd like to say, though, before we really jump into it?
No, other than thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
All right. Well, let's jump into it then.
Sounds great.
So when we talk about people getting stuck in systems like justice and health and social services, despite evidence, why are our laws and policies continuing to feed this cycle?
I mean, I think our laws and policies actually unfortunately end up perpetuating that cycle in many different ways. There was a recent report released in Saskatoon, the point-in-time homelessness count. And one of the things that I found, many, many more people are experiencing homelessness in our city than ever before. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that was identified in this report was that a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness right now identified eviction as the reason why they are currently without a place to live. And so it's worth paying attention to the way eviction laws and policies are shaping some of these issues as well. I think it's also important to also pay attention to laws and policies that benefit people who may already have power and resources in our society. And one of the issues that I'm really concerned about right now is a phenomenon called the financialization of housing. And I don't know if that's something that you've talked about or been aware of, but it's a trend across Canada, and it's definitely happening here in Saskatchewan on a pretty large scale. And that is the phenomenon of really large financialized landlords. So they're entities that are, I mean, they can be structured in different ways, but they're big landlords that buy up properties, raise rents, and some recent research has shown that the activities of financialized landlords are really linked to the housing affordability crisis, and that in turn is connected to the eviction crisis.
That makes so much sense to me, because just for an example, sort of an offshoot of that, when we were looking to purchase our home, we were quite settled in a particular area. And initially, I think that it was generally considered to be entry level. However, we've had these larger developers going in and knocking those older builds down that would have been more affordable for first-time home buyers, and putting up these like $500,000, $750,000 homes that made it unattainable for us. And so, you know, we love the area that we're in, and we're very grateful to be here. But certainly it would have been more desirable for us to be able to remain in that area where we were already sort of established. But on that point, I did kind of wonder, how is that impacting not only sort of the, you know, the stock of available housing for purchase for those entry level folks, but also how is that impacting rents in those particular areas, which would make them unattainable for the average person?
Yes. So I think that all of what you are mentioning is a phenomenon that we're seeing here and then across the country as well. We know, so there's certain things, and if we're talking about law and policy, so one thing that's been identified is that Saskatchewan, and there's a few other jurisdictions in Canada as well, but Saskatchewan is one of them. We don't have policies like rent control in Saskatchewan, and we have other aspects of our system that make our jurisdiction a really friendly place for financialized landlords and other types of landlords to operate. And we know there's research in Canada recently that's just been published that links the growing phenomenon of financialization of housing with growing problems with affordability.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll talk about this more, but one of the main reasons why tenants are being evicted in our province is because they cannot afford their rent.
Yep.
So it's rental arrears. Rent keeps going up,
Yep.
and people cannot afford to live.
Absolutely. And I think that I don't know if the trend still remains, but I know at some point there had been a trend of encouraging foreign investors in properties in Saskatoon, which also drove up the value of homes. And I think that contributed a lot to sort of the problems that we're seeing today.
It might, and I don't know as much about that area, but I know that certainly these large financialized entities, and it's not really necessarily foreign investment. It's investors from across the country who are adding these to their portfolios, and it's a very profitable
for sure
business model.
For sure, it could be. I'm wondering how family law could potentially contribute to these issues as well, because in a separation agreement, some folks are unfortunately forced, for lack of better terminology, to live in a different sort of living arrangement than they had previously grown accustomed to, and then the system itself is so lengthy, and then you have families who are struggling to make ends meet because they're not even getting support from their former spouse. Do you think that's contributing to the TAP?
I've actually just recently been involved in a book project that the book's going to be published hopefully next year. But I'm working with a professor called Anna Lund from the University of Alberta. And our project is all about this concept that we're calling legal unhousing. And we're actually looking at the way that different areas of law have different ways of contributing to people losing their home. Eviction is a big one. Criminal justice system, has different ways of affecting people's housing situations, including, putting them in prison, and that kind of thing. But there's also mortgage foreclosure. So people who own their houses sometimes can't afford their mortgage. And I think those rates are going up right now. So people are losing their housing through that type of process as well. So law is kind of everywhere, and it affects people and can cause people to lose their housing. And of course, housing is one of the most important human needs that we have. And in international human rights law, housing is considered a human right. Our federal government in 2019 passed an act where they said Canada recognizes that housing is a human right. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite make it into practice a lot of the times.
Is there a place where due diligence ends? Like, what does a housing system look like that can work for the hard to house?
Like, I don't want to throw landlords under the bus or undermine. Like, I think a lot of people have great experiences. And it's true what you said. Like, it's maybe unfair of us to expect that a landlord who wants to make a profit or, have a business, that would be then up to them to maybe deal with extremely difficult situations with tenants. The problem is that, as I said, like, housing, it's touching on human rights. So any landlord who's getting into the business, it's not just a way to make profit. It is, you're dealing with someone's human rights. And so that it's just something that I think we need to think about when we're making policy, and just thinking are we okay as a society with just saying, you know what, housing is a commodity, and it's just, if you can't afford it, or if you're not a good tenant, you're on the street. Is that okay with us as a society? And maybe we need more models, and we have lots of models of supportive housing, wraparound supports, even in the city, of, I think, programs that are really successful and that work every day really hard to support tenants and help them keep their housing, even if they might have not been maybe successful working with a big private landlord. So I think we just need way more support for those types of programs as well. And I think we also need an emphasis in our eviction law and processes to try to put more of an emphasis on prevention rather than just quick evictions.
Yes.
So
So
Yeah.
we've talked about a number of systems already today, and what we've seen is that systems seem to have a hard time working together. So why is it so hard for health, for justice, for social services to work together when someone leaves jail or a hospital or is evicted, for that matter,
Yeah.
with nowhere to go?
The question kind of assumes that if all the systems were working really close together, maybe there'd be like better care and better outcomes. And sometimes I think we also have examples of systems working really close together and it's not good outcomes, you know, for people. So an example from my own research, I did research on eviction cases in Saskatchewan where tenants were evicted because of suspected involvement in maybe illegal activities and that kind of thing. And one of the things I found in that research from looking at eviction decisions is that sometimes police are working closely with landlords, or they're, contacting landlords to say, you need to, we'll support you, in help in getting this person evicted. Sure. Like we'll, provide a letter to say we're investigating, like those kinds of things. Okay. And so then I see, like, I'm like, oh, here's some people working close together, but the outcome is eviction, and it's someone losing their housing. So I think what we really need is an emphasis on like getting systems to work together with the goal of supporting and helping people maintain stable housing somehow.
It seems like most of our systems are based on that punitive, patriarchal type of approach as opposed to that supportive, like what can we do to ensure that you don't slip under the radar or onto the radar, depending on how you interpret that, right? But it seems like, there's a lot of room for growth in that area.
For sure. And I also feel like, I mean, as an academic, it's so easy to be like, just look at the problems. I've also talked like people who are working in front lines in these systems, like they're doing their best. They don't have enough resources. Like they and they're doing amazing work a lot of the time without, but it's such a struggle, and that the issues are growing and they're really challenging. So I don't want to be like, oh, well, nothing's working, or people are doing, they're like, people are doing everything they can, I believe. So
well, that echoes what Colleen said as well. Like, we're not sitting here trying to look down on frontline workers.
Oh my gosh, no.
I think that they're all doing the best they can with the tools 100%. They're being given, the tools that they're being given.
Yeah, 100%.
So I suppose this sort of leads into my next question here when you're talking about how systems work together to evict people. And so people are being discharged and evicted, but the discharge is around, medical treatment or they're getting out of jail or something like that. And they're not being given a plan for housing or support. Now, from a legislative standpoint, why is this being allowed to happen?
Mm-hmm. Part of this, I think there's a lot of political support sometimes for this like tough on crime idea that, we're just going to take but without maybe thinking really clearly about like, well, what are the consequences of taking that approach? We were talking about legislation or like, is this legal? And like, it's not illegal. But I do think, and I was going to mention that we could look at, there's international human rights principles that apply to the way that a country is supposed to approach prisoners. And one of the principles is a commitment to meaningful, like real reintegration into society. And so I actually think we could take that human rights principle and think, like, okay, well, what does that mean to implement that? And think about the responsibilities that we have. And I think you said, like, jail and incarceration is like super expensive.
Well, and oftentimes we can also layer in there the fact that when people are discharged, say, onto the street, we have negative health outcomes, which also contribute to another system.
Absolutely.
And the cost of that. And like, I hate to boil things down to dollars when we're talking about human beings, but ultimately that's what the politicians are looking at. And that's, sometimes what the general public is looking at is what is the overall cost of this? Where by comparison, it would actually be less costly to the system and have potentially higher outcomes for individuals if the focus was shifted from supporting those systems into a more reintegrative system.
Exactly. And that's what I mean by like a rational approach. So, yes.
She doesn't even
Maybe
have
you
a
could be in
master's.
charge.
She
Yes.
doesn't
Could
even have a
you-
master's.
Could you be in charge? That would be great. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gilchrist 2026. This episode of the Speakeasy podcast is brought to you by the Saskatoon Community Foundation. The Saskatoon Community Foundation inspires philanthropy, builds community, and leads change in Saskatoon. The foundation has worked and served on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis people since 1970. We're proud to partner with SCF as we work together to spark dialogue, share knowledge, and build lasting change here in Saskatoon. Quick pause here. If you're finding value in this conversation, head over to speakeasynetwork.ca. Every episode is paired with a blog post that dives deeper into the issues we cover, offering extra context and connects you with tools and voices driving real change in Saskatchewan. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave a rating or review, drop a comment wherever you're listening. All this helps more people find these conversations and helps keep momentum going. Now, back to the episode.
So would you say Saskatchewan's current tenancy laws are balanced, or are they a system tap in and of themselves?
Okay, so this is getting now into like my main area of research. And so
Excellent.
I feel like I have a lot of thoughts on this question. So I guess I will start with saying, so I've studied the eviction decisions of our Office of Residential Tenancies. They do publish all of their decisions, and so we have access to look at like what are the outcomes, what's actually happening on the ground in that tribunal. And if you actually read our law in Saskatchewan, I think it comes across as pretty balanced. There's tenants have rights, landlords can't just evict a tenant anytime they want. According to the law, they have to meet certain procedural requirements. And there has to be, in most cases, be a hearing where everyone can share their evidence. And a really important part of our law in Saskatchewan, and this is a really good part of our law, is that even if a landlord, proves their case, like even if they can prove that a tenant is behind in their rent or hasn't paid their rent for a month or two, the hearing officer is supposed to actually do something, not just say like, have you met that requirement? They're also supposed to do another step, and they're supposed to determine whether eviction would be, and the language in the act is just and equitable in the circumstances.
Wow.
So to me, when I read that and when we see sort of what the courts have said about that, it's a good potential protection for tenants, because what it allows for is for tenants to share their circumstances and say, this month I couldn't pay my rent because maybe there's a social assistance payment, and this happens all the time, that it didn't arrive. Like there was some bureaucratic mistake and I couldn't pay my rent. Or this month I couldn't pay my rent because I was in hospital or I just had a baby and the baby's in hospital. So there's all sorts of circumstances that can mean, or like another example I've seen in the cases is I was a victim of domestic violence and my partner took my money and said he paid the rent, but he didn't. Like, so these are all things that happen in real life and you see them in the cases. So you'd think, decision makers should be making that determination, thinking like, okay, maybe we're not going to evict and we're going to provide maybe a payment plan or more time. Like, there's different options we can have. So when you ask, like, are the laws balanced? Like, I think the law can look, I have, there's ideas for maybe amendments or reform, but it's not too bad. But what I see in actual practice, and I've actually studied thousands of eviction decisions, the statistics are that landlords win their immediate eviction in about 90% of cases. So it's almost all the time, sometimes even more than that. And in the cases where they don't win, it's usually because of like a technical thing, like, oh, they didn't serve the tenant, or there was something technically wrong with the application. So what that tells me is that our tribunal is very sympathetic to the position of landlords, and that tenants, like I would say that those outcomes are not super balanced. But what you see in some of the cases is like, oh, you know, this tenant, like the stories that I just told you, all of those tenants faced immediate eviction. So, and we've seen cases like a tenant was $5 in arrears at the time of the hearing. Immediate eviction. And so to me, I start questioning, like, to what extent is that just and equitable analysis being done? And one of the problems is that tenants don't have, for the most part, don't have legal assistance. A lot of times they aren't showing up at their hearings. So I do think that that's one issue that is worth thinking about and maybe trying to think of ways that we could do better, because we don't, when we know from the point in time homelessness count, like so many of the people who are homeless right now, the reason they're homeless is because they were evicted. Like, are there ways to try to help us save that?
Well, wait. I want to ask one question about this tribunal. I'm curious. One of the lawyers I worked for, his specialty was impaired law. And usually right upon a charge of impaired driving, your license is suspended by the Highway Traffic Board. He often argued that was unjust because you are not yet proven guilty in a court of law, right? And so when we look at the Highway Traffic Board, they're not trained professionals in the sense of understanding the law. And like he would like beat his head on a brick wall trying to get them to understand where the problem in law was, right? So when we look at the Office of the Residential Tenancies, I'm wondering, like, what sort of prerequisites are required in order to sit on those tribunals, and how familiar are they with the law and then how to apply it?
The hearing officers are, for the most part, lawyers or retired lawyers, so they do know the law. The other thing I've learned from reading all these decisions is these hearing officers are incredibly short of time. The hearings, like there's probably not enough hearing officers. It's probably underfunded. And so they're running often, you know, many hearings in a given day, and they're supposed to get their decisions out right away. And in many cases, they don't have a lot to work with because, as I said, like most of the time the tenants don't show up. So they actually don't, like, I don't want to say like, oh, well, they're just, you know, evicting everyone with a with a good case, because they don't know, because the people aren't there. And so often they may not have, they don't have anything other than what the landlord said. And so that's going to, you know, generally, if you're thinking like you don't have anything else to go with, you're probably going to make the order in favor of the landlord. So there's a bunch of sort of structural sort of aspects to why their work, I think, is very difficult. And I don't want to, you know, again, I want to be sympathetic of like those circumstances as well. I think one of the things that would be helpful is maybe to have some better legal supports for tenants, and even for tenants to start learning what their rights are when it comes to eviction, and having, you know, more legal aid or other types of legal supports to assist tenants to make sure that their voices and their stories can be heard in those contexts, because sometimes they're very compelling stories.
And, you know, I mean, even though the Office of the Residential Tenancies Act process is very informal comparative to you know, courtroom, it still, for folks who have no familiarity or who have trauma surrounding, you know, that's not a space that they want to enter into without support or without an agent of some variety, right?
Yes. And I have done some research where I've spoken with tenants, and I think, you know, lawyers often think they're like, oh, like just what you said, like it's informal,
it's no
you
big
don't
deal.
need to be a lawyer, like it should be and you think about like access to justice, like anyone should feel fine just coming to this hearing. But when you talk to tenants, like, it's true, so many of the tenants facing eviction are people who are already facing incredible challenges.
Yes.
If you think it's like you're facing eviction because you couldn't pay your rent, that's probably because something's really difficult
Yes.
that's going on. Like maybe you lost your job or your kids are sick or something like that. So you probably have a lot of things on your mind. And from the tenants that I've spoken to, they've said it's super intimidating and it's super scary to imagine going and not knowing what to say, and also maybe having to face your landlord and
Sure.
and it's probably embarrassing if you're like on have had some sort of problem, that kind of thing. So I do think that tenants definitely who I've spoken to have definitely said we would love to have more support.
For sure.
And I actually also think the tribunal, and I've said it's like it's really rushed and like everything, the caseload's so big and so on, but I would love to see a more trauma informed
Yes.
process, like with wraparound supports, and even this idea of like, I don't think that in every case the tenant can maybe stay. Like maybe there's some reason why like they need to move, but can there be supports for like, where's this person going to go? Because evicting someone into homelessness that's a huge human rights violation, and that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right now, policies are often written by people who have never lived these struggles. Is there a way to require governments to involve people with lived experience when they're making their laws? Now, you were mentioning that the tribunal is very quick, very rushed, very uninformed. Do you think that there's value in consulting with lived experience, or even having some lived experience involved with that tribunal?
I love that question. And it actually reminds me. So I recently did some research where I spoke to people who had been evicted and who they'd been evicted and not attended their hearing, because we wanted to find out, why are people not attending their hearings? And I learned a lot of really interesting, but I also asked people what their recommendations were. And one person, and it was one of my favorite things that I learned in the research. He said he really thought hearing officers didn't have the right qualifications, because he said, if you haven't been homeless, you shouldn't be deciding that someone else should be homeless. And I was like, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I can't, it's hard to imagine our system changing that radically right away, but I do really feel like decision makers, people who are making law, need to really pay attention to and take seriously the lived experience expertise in making policy. When you ask, like, is there a way to require it? I guess I think that, like, legally, probably not. I think that's a political question, and I think we should probably, maybe think about voting in governments that have that as a serious concern, and ideally, voting in candidates who have lived experiences, who can then be people who can make law and policy. So that's something that would be a good. But also, there's a role for community-based researchers and lawyers and all of us to try to learn and build relationships with people so that we can understand more.
On that point, and just briefly, do you happen to know if there are any continuing professional development credits available in these particular issues and areas?
We have had some, some of the community-based, like Classic, the community-based legal clinic in Saskatoon, and some other organizations like that have done some training for, like, CPD training for lawyers in the province. So that has happened, but it's. So I guess there have been, to a limited extent, I would say. Okay. Yes. Well, but there could be more.
So we keep hearing about how poverty gets treated like a crime, and that's resonated through our conversation today. From a legal point of view, how does this happen, and how can we stop it?
When someone is homeless, so likely experiencing poverty, they have no home, the things that they have to do just to sort of survive that would not be a criminal offense for someone with a home, then gets sometimes targeted as a crime. So the example that I have in my mind, and this is, I believe, a case that Classic had some years ago, was someone who was homeless, and so all of their belongings were something that they carried with them,
Sure.
and it wasn't a lot, but one of them was a knife. And like all of us have knives, like my knives are in my kitchen at
In your
home.
drawer, yeah.
This person's knife happened to be as in part of their belongings. They somehow got stopped by police, searched their things, and they were charged with possession of a weapon. But it wasn't a weapon.
No.
It was their knife.
Yeah.
So that would be like an example in my mind of like, you're being criminalized for something that all of us have. I have knives. But
I bet you, we all have more knives than that person does.
I bet we do.
Probably.
But we're not walking around with them because we can have a home where we can keep our kitchen knives.
Well, I mean,
so that's
I've
an
even
example.
Seen, even
I
for
think
carrying a screwdriver, I've seen that be used, to criminalize an individual.
Yeah.
Either a tool for break and enter purposes, or for possession of a weapon or concealed weapon, even.
For sure.
Yeah.
People also who are living, who are homeless, are often subject to a sweep where their like shelters are dismantled, like and they're kind of feeling like sort of under surveillance or like those kinds of things. So again, those of us who have homes aren't having that kind of like, police surveillance on our activities and that kind of thing. So
when the ministry came in and inspected our home, it was a day after my son's 3rd birthday, and we had cake before I put him down for a nap.
Yeah.
And I was washing the dishes, and the door went, and I answered the door, and ministry workers were there. They basically sort of forced their way into the house, but in the process, I was on my way to answer the door, and I realized I had a butcher knife in my hand or whatever from cutting the cake, right?
Yeah.
So I set it down on the stove. Ultimately, in the report, they said unsafe storage of knives, which was used against us.
Yeah.
So,
but
it's just interesting how they can manipulate those things in order to serve ultimate agendas.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. So in my eviction research, I've looked at some of the reasons why people get evicted for behavioral reasons. And I actually saw one case where someone was evicted. And again, it's not, criminalized, but they were evicted under that emergency eviction power. And one of the things that the landlord was complaining about is that this person's kitchen was really messy, and they had like a lot of, I remember from the decision, like a lot of dried macaroni and cheese on their countertop. And I was thinking, like, a lot of people sometimes have a messy kitchen, and won't be losing their housing because of that. So I think there's, different ways of or lenses of looking at people.
I really resonate with the domestic violence issue that you raised, and from my own experience, one of the experiences that I had, I ended up with an ultimate eviction due to domestic violence because we were too loud.
Okay, wow.
Often yelling and screaming, and nobody ever called the police to protect me.
Wow.
But that was used against me.
Yeah.
For eviction, and then further complicating things, like he was gang involved, and so then they also used the emergency eviction powers based on gang association.
I'm really sorry to hear that, and also you are not the only one.
I know
that has happened to.
Yeah.
I've seen again in the decisions, I've seen people being evicted. In one case, the evidence was the ex-boyfriend arrived with a sledgehammer to the woman's apartment. And then there was an altercation, and he ended up being injured. But her story was, this was self-defense. And from what I know about domestic violence, anyone coming with a sledgehammer, like you probably think like this is maybe a domestic violence issue. But unfortunately, the hearing officer said, well, it sounded like a consensual fight, and both of them, the woman was immediately evicted. So I think there's some issues with sort of being able to identify and think about these issues in a, as I said earlier, like a trauma-informed lens for thinking about some of those issues.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Do you think law schools and legal professionals are doing enough to understand how these systems work for people?
I feel like I'm going to always say we're not doing enough, because I think we can always do more. But I do want to say that I think law schools are, and I'm thinking of our law school in particular, have developed programs and initiatives where we are trying to take that mandate seriously to educate our students and future lawyers, and frankly, future leaders in our society about some of the issues that we're talking about today. So, and the program that I wanted to highlight is we have a program called the Intensive Clinical Law Program in collaboration with Classic, and Classic is a community-based legal clinic here in Saskatoon, and we've had a program for over 10 years where we've put students are placed at Classic. They get a full semester of credit, and they are working with clients under supervision in all sorts of areas of law, including prison law. So the students actually go into the correctional center, sometimes the regional psychiatric center as well, meet with clients and help advocate for them for different issues, often like internal disciplinary matters. They meet with tenants. They go to the Office of Residential Tenancies and do advocacy there for tenants to try to protect
when
tenants'
available,
rights.
though, right?
Yeah,
there's not enough.
There's not enough. I mean, it's a drop in the
that.
bucket, probably.
Yeah.
But they get to have that firsthand experience, and we always try to frame it to them, saying, "You are going to be learning from your clients and from the community about law and about the way that the system operates. And so make sure that you don't think you know more than your client about the law, because you won't. And it's a huge learning experience, and it's sometimes very disorienting, I would say, for the students, because and I've had this experience where, like, well, but we learned in our classroom, we learned that it was like this, but then we went and we saw that this is how it's working, and it sometimes really motivates them to stay engaged and
that's beautiful
throughout their career. So I think I'd love to see that expanded.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Now, on the point of expansion, though, wasn't it recently that a significant amount of funding was cut to Classic?
So there has been some changes to the funding model, but I'm hoping that the College of Law will continue its relationship with Classic.
How accessible is the system for people with low literacy, with mental health challenges, or with
other complexities?
No internet access?
Oh, very complicated and very intimidating and very difficult. And I'm thinking, specifically if we're talking about the tribunal, the housing law system, again, I learned this in my recent research project that one person I talked to said, because he's someone who got evicted, but he didn't participate in his hearing. So I was asking, well, what happened? Like, why didn't you go? You wanted to keep your housing, and you wanted to not lose your housing. And he said to me that he saw the eviction notice or the hearing notice, but then he said, but I can't read because I have literacy issues. He had spent lots of time incarcerated, and even someone who can read super well, when they see a legal notice, I think a lot of people
clam up
or like shut down, or just they're like, I can't, like, almost like you get intimidated and then you can't make sense of it. Absolutely. So I think that's a very common thing for anyone. So it's not even it's like a legal, like, form, it's like literacy,
psychological warfare.
It's really intimidating.
Well,
so
I
think that's the
tend
thing.
To be a little bit complicated as well, because you receive the written reasons for the eviction, and then you're expected to respond in writing before you even get in front of the tribunal. And for some folks, just putting that all into a sensible sort of fashion, that in and of itself is asking too much.
I think it's really scary for a lot of people. And so imagine, and then again, we also know, so the hearings here in Saskatchewan during the pandemic, they switched to telephone hearings, which, made sense during the pandemic. And then they've just actually carried that on. So most of the hearings are actually by telephone, which, I think for some people it makes it more accessible.
Sure.
But we can't forget that a lot of people, and especially people who are the ones who are facing eviction, we have a digital divide in our society where there are groups of people who don't have access to a cell phone or a cell phone or minutes on their phone or, an
I've
ability.
Been there. Donna's been there.
Yeah.
It's, and some people also, and I saw again in the research that we did, like they might have a phone, but they're like intimidated by like the technology of it, right? And don't maybe have like a setting on where it blocks the call that's incoming from the tribunal and don't know how to change that. And so then they miss their hearing because of that.
When you're living rough, time is completely different than for the standard individual who's, got to get the kids out to school at 9 a.m. and has got to do this and this and this and this. Like just the time and awareness of time is completely different.
And also, if you're surviving, like you're probably busy, like you might not have time to like, prepare for a hearing, and that kind of thing.
Or calling every day to stay on the detox wait list.
100%.
So I don't know if we mentioned, but Donna spent 18 months on the street.
Okay, I think I saw that. So yeah. You have lived experience.
I do.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. A few different layers to it.
Yeah. Lived experience runs this table.
Yes.
Yep.
But, I mean, just the unreasonable expectation of systems to demand that individuals sit on hold all day and then maybe never get through. And then you got to try again tomorrow. And there might be one community phone available. Yeah. And you've got 6 or 7 or at minimum other folks trying to access that same phone to do the same thing. Like, sure.
Basic communications is a systems tap.
Yeah. And the waiting and the...
Like you have nothing better to do.
And the time. Yeah. No, I think that's, it's a huge issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Are there any eviction trends that you're seeing currently in Saskatoon that concern you?
One is that the majority of evictions are for rental arrears. So that means people who fell behind in their rent or they just couldn't pay their rent 1 month. One of the things I notice with that, and I guess the first thing that's telling me is that there's, a large number of people who cannot afford their rent. So, rents are, and we all know rents are going up. And so it makes sense that people are falling through the cracks and not being able to afford their rent. And that's a huge driver of eviction. The other thing that I notice, and it connects to what we talked about a little bit earlier about the different types of landlords. So I've looked at sort of different types of landlords and how they approach rental arrears and evictions. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is those large financialized landlords, the corporate landlords, they evict, they're very quick to evict. So on average, it's like tenants sometimes are owing less than a month of rent. So it's a couple $100, they've fallen behind like 1 month, maybe 1.5 months in rent, and they're kind of moving very quickly to an eviction order. Whereas we see the mom and pop type landlords, they wait a little longer. And to me, that makes a little bit of sense because they have a relationship with their tenants. Usually it's not a corporate relationship. It's a personal one. And so it kind of makes sense that those individual landlords might wait a little longer. Still it might be that they can't have like too much tolerance because maybe sometimes they're like, well, now I can't pay the mortgage or whatever.
I can't pay my bills.
But you see that they're waiting a little longer. And then the landlords that wait the longest to evict for arrears, and again, this makes sense to me too, are the social public landlords, because they do, I believe, a lot of work on eviction prevention and to try to make sure that people aren't, because that's their mandate. They're trying to provide housing. So that I see as, an interesting trend.
So I'm wondering, and this is going to take us back a few years, but I'm hoping that we can extrapolate from some of the data that you're seeing or has been formed over these years, in that when there was that shift from direct payment to landlord.
Yeah.
There must have been a bulk of people that unfortunately slipped off, because I don't even feel like there was enough information and education given to those individuals who were in receipt of social services that direct payment was no longer happening. And so they received this money and they didn't understand why. And so they spent it not understanding, right? So there's
That was
that
your
whole
rent money.
education piece, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then, as we know, typically what happens is once you fall into that housing deficit situation, it becomes even more difficult to get housing and maintain stable housing and all the things, right? And so I'm wondering how that's affecting numbers today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we see it, like I've seen that a little bit in the decisions, that there's like a problem with this SIS payment or whatever that, coming through, and then people fall behind. But I think I think it's like a theory of why eviction was such a big driver of homelessness in the last point in time. Homelessness count, a lot of people identified that was a driving factor for sure. So,
well, I know even from my own experience, like I was on basic income and then was transitioned into SIS. When I was on basic, I had qualified and grandfathered in the rental housing supplement.
Okay, yeah.
But then under the new framework, they considered that income. And so on the one hand, they were still providing me with that rental housing supplement, but then from the SIS perspective,
were they clawing back?
They were clawing it back.
Right. Yeah.
So I ended up losing like $600 a month.
Right. And I'm sure you found, because there's no way that the amount that people get can pay rent because like the average rent is like over $1,000, and people aren't receiving that much. So then I think what we're seeing is people living to like getting roommates, living together, and that's another issue that I see in the decisions too. Is like people are getting evicted because of the actions of roommates, like maybe the roommates haven't paid their part of the rent, or their behavioral issues or something like that, but people don't have control over it. But then everyone loses their housing.
The police won't get involved because it's outside of their jurisdiction purportedly. But and then if it's gang related, even if it's through no choice of the original tenant, there's not a lot of mechanisms that exist in a safe way for that individual to maybe separate themselves from that activity. Like what I'm alluding to here is we had clients who were not gang involved, but their relatives were. And so as soon as that individual got housed, those relatives would then move themselves in, create havoc,
and then everyone
gets evicted. And so it's a really unfortunate situation for those individuals.
In situations like that, I'm also thinking, it's so unfair for the people who are losing their housing, but I've also heard, concerns from, neighbors and like other people who are like, well, but there's like violence going on next door, and like it's really scary for my kids. So like I guess I guess I don't have all the answers.
And I'm not discounting that other side of the coin by any stretch of the imagination. I guess more so what I'm saying is it's unfortunate that if you find yourself in that sort of a dynamic, that there aren't other mechanisms, maybe that could help, because the landlord doesn't want to get involved because there's safety concerns. The police don't want to get involved because it's not their problem, basically. It's outside of their scope of enforcement.
It's civil, it's not criminal.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Although, sometimes they will, but
that involves laying charges. Which you generally don't want to do when you're, engaged with these folks. And especially if you're going to end up having to be continued housed in that particular area, it becomes a safety concern. So it's a really unfortunate and interesting area of that. Sort of issue.
It's really, really difficult, I think.
Anything you want to say before you leave us today? Anything you want to say to any law students or professionals that might be watching or listening? Any words of advice, wisdom?
Well, I would say, as lawyers, I think we have a responsibility to care about human rights and access to justice. And I think that's something that I'm excited to be part of a community of lawyers and people in the community who are really part of doing committed to that kind of work. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Take good care.
Thank you.
Hold on. For more context and tools tied to this episode, visit speakeasynetwork.ca. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment or review wherever you're tuning in. It really helps. And if you're ready for more, go ahead and click on the next video right here on the screen.